Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon session in the FCC Theatre. My name's Ingrid Christensen, and looks like I'll be chairing duties this afternoon with Tammy Jones. We both work with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. Going to get right on to things. Our first speaker is Dr. Alejandro Costamagna. He's a professor at the Department of Entomology at the University of Manitoba. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because he has lots to say. Just a couple of quick reminders. If you could make sure that you turn down your cell phones. If you're taking a call, please step completely out of the theater so as not to distract the speakers. And if you're a CCA, please make sure that you sign up for your CCA credits at the back or at the top outside the door. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ingrid. Thank you very much to the organization for the opportunity to talk with you. So today I'm going to try to convince you of the importance of having beneficial insects in your farms, and that we gain an appreciation of all the services they provide for us and how they help to make agriculture even more sustainable. So first I'm going to introduce some of the services that we receive from insects and other arthropods. Then I'm going to show you some studies that show how important they are in lots of systems. And then I'm going to talk about the role of crop and non-crop areas in the agricultural landscape, supporting these populations of beneficial insects that we can use to keep our pests at bay. So first, just quickly, we call ecosystem services all those ecosystem functions that provide benefits to humans. And insects and arthropods are crucial to some of them. There was an early study in 2006 which started to estimate this in North America. And here are a few numbers that they come up with. Let's see. Processing dung, for example, is about a little bit less than $1 billion per year in the US. Pollination by wild insects, so this is excluding bees, domesticated bees, is about $3 billion per year. Pest control of native herbivores, about $4.5 billion per year. And if we consider insects as food for wildlife and support all these industries, is about $50 billion per year. So these are very conservative estimates. What I'm going to talk today is about pest control, and this estimate is from 2006, and it's only native insects, not considering invasive insects that are pests, which are some of the most common and damaging pests. So when we consider beneficial insects providing pest control services, we're talking about biological control. So that's using living organisms to control pests, and we have three types. A classical biological control will be when we have an invasive species to bring a natural enemy from the same area that species is from, because it's adapted to attack them and usually keeps them under control. If you have greenhouses or enclosed production, another strategy is to release commercially rare natural enemies to control them instead of using insecticides. And the third strategy, which is what I'm going to talk today, is try to increase the abundance and the effectiveness of beneficial insects that are present in the agroecosystems and make them more effective to control the pest. And this is what we call conservation biological control. So I thought I'll take this opportunity to reiterate what most of you hopefully know, which is that there are a lot of beneficial insects in our agroecosystem. So here are a few pictures of them. You probably know that spiders. Spiders are all predators. Lady beetles are important predators of aphids. Damsel bugs, minute parrot bugs, green lacewings, the larvae are important predators. Hoverflies, the adults, some of them are pollinators. The larvae, which is this one here, is an important predator. So there are a lot of insects feeding on herbivores, so potential pests that we have that never become pests because we have these beneficial insects constantly foraging them. Okay. So these are predators. So we have two main type of natural enemies, predators and parasitoids, parasitoid wasps. Some of you might know them. This is a bit like the movie Alien, which hopefully I'm not the oldest person here. I've seen the movie. So if you see the movie, there's this alien that kind of parasitize. The larvae get into the body of humans, feed on them, and then emerge spectacularly and very bloodily. Well, the inspiration for that movie is not outside our planet, are those parasitoid wasps. They do exactly the same. They do that with pretty much every arthropod that's there. And pretty much every pest you have at least one, but typically more species of these parasitic wasps, which we call parasitoids, attacking them. So typically they start laying an egg. They're in a caterpillar. Inside the caterpillar, there's one larvae or more larvae. Then eventually the caterpillar, which looks perfectly normal for most of the time, then suddenly start twitching and being very uncomfortable. And you may have one or hundreds of these little larvae emerging, pupating, and at that point the caterpillar dies, and these wasps go and attack other ones. And here are pictures of some of them. So these are wasps that utilize what we know in bees as a stinger. In reality, evolve as to lay eggs. So these wasps do not sting you. They use the stinger as an ovipositor to lay the eggs. So they are very beneficial. They attack aphids. When the aphids die, they form these mummies, which you may see in the field. That's a very good sign that you have natural enemies in your field. But they attack all sorts of insects. And we have different kinds, just to show you quickly, some that are solitary. They produce only one larva per caterpillar or per host. Some of them put many eggs. Every time they sting the caterpillar, they will lay multiple eggs, not just one. And it can be hundreds of them emerging, like in this poor armyworm here. And then you have another kind, which are polyembryonic, which lay only one egg, but then the egg divided inside the caterpillar or the host, and again, hundreds of them can emerge. So one of these parasitized caterpillar can lead to hundreds of these wasps that will look for other caterpillars. And the other important category are these egg parasitoids. So these are tiny caterpillar eggs. They're less than a millimeter. And these tiny, tiny wasps develop inside there. So the adult is about the size of a caterpillar, and they are very important. They're reared commercially in some systems. Wasps are not the only parasitoids. Flies are all, some groups of flies are important parasitoids, and flies tend to lay, they don't have a stinger, so they will lay the eggs in the outside, and then the larva will make a hole and get in the caterpillar. But other than that, it's exactly the same. In all cases, the host, the caterpillar, the aphid, the lygus, whatever is the host, will die when these emerge. And even beetles have some groups that attack them, that behave as parasitoids. In this case, they attack the root maggot, and they attack the pupa. So in a lot of groups of insects, these are the three major ones, we have this strategy that is extremely beneficial for us. So now we're going to talk about the importance of these natural enemies controlling some pests. And I'm going to use an example, the soybean aphid system. This is an invasive species, was detected in 2000 in North America, in the Great Lakes region, and expanded very quickly to all the Midwest and southern Canada. It produced a lot of yield losses. Before the arrival of this aphid, there wasn't really spraying in soybean. So it changes completely soybean production in the Midwest. And at first, the idea was that the natural enemies present were not able to control them. So we did some studies to try to test if natural enemies can control them. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay. So we tested whether predators control them. We found one parasitoid wasp that attacked them in the field in very low levels. So we were interested to see if they will control them. And, of course, we know the aphid will produce yield losses. So I'll go quickly through this. The way we prove their effect, one of the ways we do, I'll show you two ways today, is to exclude the natural enemies, exclude, in this case, different groups, and see when we prevent them to attack the aphids, whether we'll have more aphids. So we use these cages for that. The design is a bit complicated. I'm not going to go into the details. Have two types of cages. In these two types, we put aphids at the same number at the field level. And in one of them, we introduce the parasitoids, but has this screen that prevents the larger predators. The other type of cage, we have openings on the sides and at the top. And then predators that occur naturally in the field can attack those aphids. And we have one in which we put just aphids, another treatment in which we put the aphids and the parasitoid, because the parasitoid was not naturally there, we have to add it, but the natural enemies were, the predators were those that were present. And then we have a cage that we make sure there wasn't any aphids inside at any time. We inspect them periodically, and that gives us a measure of how much the plants will yield in these conditions when they were not exposed at all to aphids. So here are the results of this in number of aphids per plant. This is in a log scale, so little increases here and lots of aphids there. It's a lot of fun to count this. We count up to 60,000 in a plant, and this across several weeks of the experiment. And there are two lines I'm going to show you here. This is the economic threshold level. This is when you need to apply an insecticide if you're doing this commercially to prevent yield losses. And the line on top, so that's, for this case, is 250 aphids per plant. And the line on top is the economic injury level, which is the level at which you actually start losing money if you didn't do anything before. Okay, so the threshold, as you probably know, is set up about a week before you reach that to give you time to arrange an insecticide application. So the important line not to cross really is this one. And what we found is when we put aphids only, which is the blue line, the populations increase exponentially, way above the injury level. Those plants will result in yield losses. When we added just the parasitoid, this species that we found occasionally wasn't effective at controlling them. But when we have the aphids, the same number, we all start with the same number, exposed to predators, which in this case were mainly lady beetles, we have very good control, and the population of aphids never cause enough damage. And I'll show you that in a minute. So here is a measurement of plant yield in grams per square meter. When we have no aphids, this is this column here, so more than 20 grams per meter square. When we have aphids, that decrease about a third of the yield, so we have significant yield losses. When we had just the parasitoids were not enough to stop the aphids, so we have the same yield losses. But when we expose them to predators, we have the same yield as there were no aphids at all in these plants. Okay, so they were very good at controlling the aphids. If you look here, it doesn't, aphid populations do not increase. It just means that allow us to tolerate some levels of aphids, and we still have good yield. Now, one of the questions, and if you have worked or visited soybean in the Midwest, you will see that it's very hard to see these natural enemies. The same here in most crops, you will see pests, but it's hard to see these natural enemies. They seem to be in very low numbers. So one of the questions is, how many do we need, since they seem to be in very low numbers? And we did a study to try to assess that. So here are 12 fields that we monitor for soybean aphid in Minnesota, and there are different dynamics in these fields. They were all at the same time in different locations, and some of them went above the economic threshold, which is the orange line here. Some of them were a little bit above, some more on the economic injury level, which is this line. So these fields will experience yield losses unless there was a control measure. So even in the same year, in relatively close locations, we have one of the main challenges, which is the populations of the pests are extremely varied. Okay? So We sample the aphids. We have cases to prove the effectiveness of the predators, as I showed you before. And we sample the predators with different methods. We found the most abundance were these two lady beetles, the multicolor Asian lady beetle and Coccinea septipunctata, the 7-spotted lady beetle, and the minute parrot bug. And we found that the one that really was related to decreases in aphid populations was the multicolor Asian lady beetles. So we fit a mathematical model. And I'll illustrate how many we need to control them using these 3 fields here. Okay? So what we did is we walk in. One of the methods we used, which was the most practical, was to walk in the field and do transects of 25 meters. And as we were walking, we will just count the lady beetles we found. And typically, we found a range of lady beetles that we can characterize as fields in which there were a very low number of lady beetles. This is in the weeks of study how they increase. They increase up to 1 per transect, so this is very low densities. In fields that have intermediate number of aphids, they increase to 5 per transect. And in fields that have high infestations, they increase towards the season to levels of 25 per transect, so about 1 per meter. Okay? So now when we use our model to predict control, this is represented here. So what this means is in this field, which we have low aphid populations, never reached the threshold, having very low number of lady beetles, a maximum of 1 per transect was more than enough to control them throughout the season. Of course, if you have more, the aphid population would be very low. When we have intermediate one, when we have only very, very few lady beetles, 1 per transect was not enough at some point, probably not very much loss. But having intermediate or high levels was more than enough to keep them under control. And even when we have an outbreak of aphids, in cases where we normally will spray, if we have enough lady beetles, if we have a quick response by a large number, like we see in some fields, we will obtain control. If we have few lady beetles, they will be out of control. So the point of this is to show you that sometimes when you go and you look and you see no natural enemies, they might be present there. They're just at very low numbers, but those very low numbers sometimes are crucial to control the pests. So we know they can be very effective. We have repeated these studies with cases many, many times in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, different places. In all cases, we have good control. And in all cases, we have aphids exploding aphid populations exploding as soon as we keep the natural enemies out. But we know in some cases natural enemies were not enough. We still need to spray. So one of the questions is, why is that? What varies in that? And one of the things that varies is the landscape around the fields that we work. And that's what we are studying now. So if you think about the field crop from the perspective of an insect, it's a very harsh place for long periods of time. It's not a permanent habitat. We till, we harvest. And early in the season, this is a picture of a soybean field. It's a very harsh environment. If you go, there will be little plants. It will be very warm during the day, very cold during the night. Not a lot of places, not a lot of food. So having around areas with natural or semi-natural vegetation that have either trees or shrubs or even grassland will have a lot more resources for our beneficial insects. And this is a picture of a prairie in Michigan. And if you compare these two habitats, then you'll have moderate microclimates. There will be food for them in forms of prey, hosts for parasitoids, alternative plants in which they feed. Some of the natural enemies we have are omnivores. They can feed on the plants if they need to. Nectar and pollen resources, and especially in our regions, overwintering sites. Okay. And if you think about the regions where we do agriculture, they are quite varied sometimes, in short distances even, in terms of the landscape that around the fields. So these are circles that we draw around focal fields that we study. in Manitoba. And we can see in some regions, there's still quite a lot of different types of crops and vegetation in relatively smaller areas. There are some areas that are intermediate. Here we see more field crops. And there are some areas, as I'm sure you're familiar with, that all you see around are crops, very few trees and areas. So these are very hard for all sorts of insects, but beneficials in particular. So this motivates the idea that if we have more crop area, the number of beneficials will decrease, and then we'll have more pest problems. And that was investigated a while ago in Europe in this paper and several other papers, in which they show, and this is with oilseed rape, canola, rape pollen beetle, and they show that the damage by rape pollen beetle in canola in Germany decrease substantially when you have more non-crop area, and that was explained by an increase in the percentage parasitism. So there were two species of parasites that attacked this rape pollen beetle. The more non-crop area you have, the better the habitats for these parasitoid populations, the better the control of this pest. So there were a lot of studies done about that until this study in 2018, in which Karp et al. Summarized a lot of the data and got reanalyzed data from multiple places, 31 countries, 132 studies, more than 6,700 field sites in all continents. They put together a gigantic data set and they start analyzing, okay, having non-crop areas, having natural areas, they consistently, in all cases, increase the abundance of natural enemies and decrease the pest. And sadly, the response is no. Depends where you did the study, depends on a lot of things. So here is summarized here. There were about the same number of positive responses to natural vegetation as negative, a bunch that were not significant, and the same for pest. It wasn't a clear pattern, so there's no guarantee if you increase the amount of non-crop area across the globe, that's the solution. So we need to study in each system, or we need to start something else that's important, at least in some systems. And this is what I'm going to try to talk to you now. Two studies that we did that point to other things that could be beneficial for these predators and natural enemies. So this is a study done to study predation of melon aphid in Australia. And we did this with little melon plants with colonies of aphids that we put in these fields before the crop emerged. And we did that to assure that any control of those aphids was coming from predators moving from outside those fields, so from provided by the landscape. So we have several levels of exclusion. During 2 weeks, complete exclusion, so these aphids were protected from the predators. We delay the arrival of the predators 1 week. We protect them here, the aphids, then we open, have the control treatment open in the first week, and we have a treatment that was from the beginning exposed to whatever natural enemies were there. And what we found is that the percentage of alfalfa in the landscape was the most important predictor. The more alfalfa we have, the less aphids we have in these cases. So having alfalfa was beneficial to control this aphid. Having grasslands had the opposite effect, diluted the effect of the predators. And that actually made sense. I'll talk about that in a minute. So when we classify this landscape into two groups, landscape that have high levels of alfalfa, which were about 11% of alfalfa, versus landscape that have 3% of alfalfa, we always have more aphids when we have less alfalfa in the landscape, even if they're early, arriving the predators, they arrive in the first week, or they arrive only in the second week. We always have less aphids in this landscape with high proportion of alfalfa. And that makes total sense because alfalfa is an irrigated crop there. It's a very dry area. These are creeks where they do agriculture, horticulture using irrigation. Alfalfa is irrigated, but the natural vegetation around those are not. It's very dry. It's not very productive. And it doesn't have really lots of insects. We did sample as many fields as we can within 1 kilometer around those fields that we study with these sticky traps. And we found that the highest number of insects was in alfalfa. An L for Luzerne here. So the highest number was in alfalfa of predators that can fly. And actually the lowest number were in the main non-crop area, which was the natural vegetation. And then we have spiders ballooning all over the place, so we didn't see any difference. But this points out that certain crops, in this case alfalfa, which are particular in the sense that it's a perennial crop, it's irrigated, it's not treated with insecticide, can actually also help to increase pest control services. So when I came to Manitoba, I started looking at alfalfa, and we did an experiment to first see if the natural enemies in alfalfa here have the potential to consume pests outside alfalfa. And we did that again with soybean aphid. We have a treatment of soybean aphids in potted plants exposed to all predators, one in which we prevent ground predators with a barrier, so this is exposed to flying predators only, and these ones which were protected from predators. So we put this in soybean fields, and we put this in pair alfalfa fields, so neighboring alfalfa fields, to see if the predators in alfalfa will actually go and feed on these soybean aphids. We can't put the soybean aphids in alfalfa because they are specialists of soybeans, so we have to put the plants there. And as a check, we control predation in pea aphids that occur in alfalfa. So we did the same manipulations, having some control number of aphids here, here, and here. Okay. So I'll simplify this. What we need to do here, these are the results. This is from predation at Carman. But we did this in 3 other locations as well, and we have identical results. So here we have the log of the number of aphids in each case, and in blue we have when we exclude the predators, so much higher numbers when we exclude predators than when we expose them to predators, just foliar predators, the flying predators, or the ground predators. And that was true for soybean aphid in soybean, but also was about the same for soybean aphid when we put it in alfalfa. So this shows that predators in alfalfa will attack and consume and control the populations of soybean aphid. And we have other studies that we show that they actually move between alfalfa and soybean. And then this is just pea aphid controlling alfalfa to show that, and there's no difference. So they are equally accepting soybean aphid as a prey as pea aphid. And the other thing we did is to sample the predators. And this is just to, again, highlight the importance of alfalfa as a habitat for predators. We have huge number of predators in alfalfa fields compared to neighboring fields in soybean, because soybean has very few prey for them, but alfalfa have lots of aphids, not treated. So there's lots of these predators available there that will move into neighboring fields and control pests in those. So then we did another study to try to assess what are the importance of different habitats and crop in the landscape to provide these natural enemies. And we use the same methodology as before, but we did this in many different fields in Manitoba, in a total of 27 over 2 years. We put aphid colonies that were protected with these cages and pair them with unprotected aphid colonies. And we monitor the movement of beneficials into those fields with these bidirectional malaise traps in at least one of the borders of the field. Then we made the maps. We quantify all the habitats and crops in there. Here's a picture of the malaise traps. So you can see it very well, but there's 2 jars, one on each side, so we can tell how the insects that were coming from wheat from the insects that were coming from soybean. We collect them separately. And what we found is, again, good levels of control of soybean aphid across all the fields. After 1 week, we have half the population. After 2 weeks, we have a quarter of the population that we would have if we remove natural enemies. But the intensity of that varied per field. which suggests that depending where the fields were located, we will have better or worse control. And that's what we analyze here. And what we found is that the amount of cereal, the percentage of the landscape that was occupied by cereals, which is mainly wheat in this case, really decreased the number of aphids. So the more cereals you have, the less aphids problems you'll have. And we found the opposite effect with canola. When we look at the movement of natural enemies using those bidirectional malaise traps, what we found is that the amount of green lace winds was the most important predictor of the number of aphids. So the more lace winds you have, the better the control for the aphid, the less aphids you'll have. And for brown lacewind, we have the opposite that suggests that they actually go and aggregate in places where you have lots of aphids. We also found negative associations with the number of lady beetles, a very similar pattern as this, but this model was statistically more important than this model. Now, when we combine the habitats and the natural enemy movement, what we found is the best models were at low scale. So at low scale, having these green lacewinds contribute to control the aphids. And then we found that canola and the amount of grasses you have around these fields actually disrupted the control of the aphids. Okay. So what does this all mean? Hopefully we can reach some conclusions. So hopefully I show you that natural enemies are important to control pests. They have really the potential to do. They most of the time do it. Every time we exclude them in any experiment we have done, including here in Manitoba, we have an outbreak of aphids. So the fact that you don't have an outbreak of aphids usually means that you have natural enemies foraging them. They are at very low numbers. You don't notice them, but they are crucial for you to keep pests under control. We also know that natural enemies need multiple habitats. When we harvest a crop, when we till the field, there's no habitat for them. So we need to start looking into what they do outside the season, early in the season, and try to increase their numbers. Alfalfa is a good source of natural enemies for other crops. It's a perennial crop. It's something we can manage with that in mind as well. Natural vegetation in our studies here and in our studies in Australia, for different reasons, doesn't seem to be important, but this system is a system in which these pests arrive late in the season. So what we think is natural vegetation is more important as an overwintering habitat, as has been shown with other pests that are more early season. And then we will see better effects or more effects of them if we study early season pests. So we are not discarding its importance. We found that cereals and wheat in particular are important to increase the control of soybean aphid in our province or in our region. And that makes sense because there is this timing issue. Cereals are present earlier in the season, green. They harbor aphid populations, normally at low levels because we have this lady beetle and minute pirate bugs and green lacewing feeding on them. They don't cause any problem, but they support this population of beneficials. By the time wheat senesces, soybean becomes colonized with aphids, and then these predators move to soybean and control the aphids, and that's why we think we have this very strong relationship between the amount of cereals in the landscape and the control of pests in soybean. And I guess the take-home message is that we need to start understanding better what kind of habitats we need for these beneficials so we can use them to our advantage, because they certainly have the potential to protect completely our yield and avoid the need of using insecticides or reduce them at least. So, as a final thing, we are going a step forward, a project led by Dr. Jason Gibbs, with Dr. Yvonne Lawley, Rob Golden, and myself. We are establishing flower strips on the side of fields here in Manitoba, in an effort to provide perennial habitat with resources for beneficial insects, particularly for pollinators, but also for predators, because a lot of predators, particularly the parasitoid wasp, will use nectar and pollen to be more effective to parasitize pests. So we are establishing in some fields this plot. We started this summer. Here are some pictures of the plots. And we're going to start measuring if we can detect benefits of having these strips by the side of the fields in terms of pollination services and pest control services. And with that, I would like to thank all the many funding agencies. There's a lot of people and students that help to collect this work. And if we have time, I'll be happy to take any question if that's possible. Thank you very much for your attention.